What if I told you that on a sweltering August morning in 1892, a seemingly ordinary Victorian daughter would become the center of America's most notorious murder case? A case so shocking, so brutal, that it would spawn nursery rhymes, countless books, movies, and over 130 years of debate. This is the story of Lizzie Borden, a 32-year-old spinster from Fall River, Massachusetts, who may or may not have taken an axe to her father and stepmother. By the end of this video, you'll understand why this case continues to fascinate and divide people more than a century later. But first, let me paint you a picture of Fall River in 1892, a bustling industrial city where the Borden family lived in a world of strict Victorian values and hidden tensions. The Bordens weren't just any family. They were wealthy, respected, and about to become the most infamous household in American criminal history. Our story begins with Andrew Jackson Borden, a 69-year-old businessman who had built his fortune through shrewd investments in real estate and banking. Despite his wealth, Andrew was notoriously frugal, refusing to install modern conveniences like electricity or indoor plumbing in their Second Street home. Andrew had been married twice. His first wife, Sarah, died in 1863, leaving him with 3 daughters, Emma, Lizzie, and Alice, who died in infancy. 3 years later, he married Abby Durfee Gray, a woman his daughters would never fully accept as their mother. Abby Borden was 64 years old in 1892, a quiet woman who struggled to find her place in the Borden household. The relationship between Abby and Andrew's daughters, particularly Lizzie, was strained at best, hostile at worst. Lizzie Andrew Borden was born on July 19, 1860, and by 1892, she was what Victorian society called a spinster, an unmarried woman in her 30s. She was actively involved in her church, the Central Congregational Church, and various charitable organizations in Fall River. But beneath the surface of this respectable family lay tensions that had been building for years. The Borden daughters felt that their stepmother was trying to isolate them from their father and further potentially influence his will. Emma, the older sister, was 41 and often traveled, leaving Lizzie alone with their parents for extended periods. The house on 2nd Street became a pressure cooker of family, dysfunction, financial disputes, and barely concealed animosity. Now, let me describe the layout of the Borden house, because understanding the physical space is crucial to understanding what happened next. The house was a narrow, 3-story building, typical of middle-class Victorian homes, but with an unusual feature: no central hallway. To get from the front of the house to the back, you had to walk through multiple rooms. This layout would later become significant when investigators tried to piece together the movements of everyone in the house on that fateful morning. The ground floor consisted of a sitting room at the front, a dining room in the middle, and a kitchen at the back. Upstairs were the bedrooms, including Andrew and Abby's room at the front and Lizzie's room at the back. Now, as we approach August 4th, 1892, the temperature in Fall River had been unusually high for several days. The heat was oppressive, making everyone irritable and uncomfortable, a detail that would later be used both to explain and excuse certain behaviors. On the evening of August 3rd, Andrew and Abby Borden attended a family dinner, but both became violently ill afterward. Lizzie later claimed she believed they had been poisoned, though this was never proven. That same evening, Emma had left Fall River to visit friends in nearby Fairhaven, leaving Lizzie alone with her parents. This absence would later be seen by some as conveniently timed, though Emma had made these plans well in advance. The household also included Bridget Sullivan, a 26-year-old Irish maid whom the family called Maggie. Bridget had worked for the Bordens for nearly 3 years and would become a key witnessing the events about to unfold. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, Andrew Borden followed his usual routine, leaving the house early to attend to his business affairs in downtown Fall River. He made his rounds visiting his bank and various properties, conducting the financial dealings that had made him one of the wealthiest men in the city. Meanwhile, back at the house, Abby Borden was going about her morning activities. According to later testimony, she had asked Bridget to wash the windows, both inside and outside, detail that would prove significant. Around 9 a.m., Andrew returned home for an unusual mid-morning visit. He rarely came home during business hours, but on this particular morning, he decided to rest on the sofa in the sofa. In the particular morning, he decided to rest on the sofa in the sitting room. What happened next would shock Fall River, captivate the nation, and create one of America's most enduring mysteries. At approximately 11:10 a.m., Lizzie Borden's voice pierced the morning air with a cry that would echo through history. "Maggie, come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Bridget Sullivan, who had been resting in her third-floor room, rushed downstairs to find a scene of unimaginable horror. Andrew Borden lay on the sitting room sofa, his face completely destroyed by what appeared to be axe blows. The attack had been so vicious that his left eye had been split in half and his nose completely severed. But this was only the beginning of the nightmare. Dr. Seabury Bowen, the family physician who lived next door, was summoned immediately. As Dr. Bowen examined Andrew's body, a neighbor named Adelaide Churchill came over too. "Comfort Lizzie." Mrs. Churchill asked the question that everyone would soon be asking. "Where is your mother?" Lizzie's response was telling. "I don't know. She had a note to go see someone who is sick, but I don't know but what she is killed too." Notice that Lizzie referred to Abby as mother to Mrs. Churchill, though she typically called her stepmother by her first name. Mrs. Churchill suggested they search for Abby, and it was Bridget Sullivan who made the second horrific discovery. In the upstairs guest room, Abby Borden lay face down in a pool of blood, her skull crushed by multiple axe blows. The attack on Abby had been even more brutal than the one on Andrew. She had been struck 19 times with what appeared to be the same weapon that killed her husband. But here's where the timeline becomes crucial and deeply troubling for Lizzie's version of events. The medical examiner later determined that Abby had been dead for at least an hour, possibly 90 minutes, before Andrew was killed. This meant that while Andrew was downtown conducting business, Abby was already lying dead upstairs. And according to all accounts, only Lizzie and Bridget were in the house during this crucial time period. The Fall River police arrived quickly, but their investigation would later be criticized as inadequate and contaminated. The crime scene was not properly secured, and numerous people trampled through the house before evidence could be properly collected. City Marshal Rufus Hilliard was among the first officials to question Lizzie. Her answers were inconsistent and would later be used as evidence against her. When asked where she was when her father was killed, Lizzie gave conflicting accounts. Sometimes she said she was in the barn looking for fishing sinkers. Other times she claimed to be eating pears in the backyard. The barn story became particularly problematic when investigators found that the barn loft, where Lizzie claimed to have been, was stifling hot and covered with dust. There were no footprints in the dust, and no evidence that anyone had been there recently. Meanwhile, the search for the murder weapon began immediately. Police scoured the house, the yard, and the surrounding area, but the axe used to kill the Bordens was never definitively found. However, in the basement of the Borden house, investigators did find several axes and hatchets. One hatchet appeared to have been recently broken, with its handle removed and the head covered in what looked like ashes. This broken hatchet would become a key piece of evidence in the case against Lizzie. The prosecution would later argue that she had broken off the handle to dispose of blood evidence and covered the head with ashes from the cellar stove. But perhaps the most damaging evidence against Lizzie emerged 3 days after the murders. On August 7th, Alice Russell, a friend of the family, witnessed Lizzie burning a dress in the kitchen stove. When questioned about this, Lizzie claimed that the dress was old and stained with paint, so she decided to burn it. However, the timing of this dress burning, just 3 days after the murders, struck many as highly suspicious. Emma Borden rushed back from Fairhaven upon hearing the news, arriving the evening of August 4th. She immediately became Lizzie's most vocal defender, insisting her sister was incapable of such violence. The community of Fall River was divided from the very beginning. Some supported Lizzie, seeing her as a respectable Christian woman who could never commit such horrible acts. Others pointed to the family tensions, the inheritance issues, and Lizzie's inconsistent statements as evidence of her guilt. The case became a sensation in the local and national press. On August 11, 1892, exactly 1 week after the murders, Lizzie Borden was arrested and charged with the deaths of her father and stepmother. The arrest warrant was served while she was at the funeral home, making final arrangements for the burial. The preliminary hearing began on August 25th and lasted for several days. During this hearing, many of the key facts of the case were established, including the timeline of the murders and the physical evidence. One of the most significant pieces of testimony came from Eli Bentz, a pharmacist who claimed that Lizzie had tried to purchase prussic acid, a deadly poison, the day before the murders. Lizzie denied this, but the testimony added another layer of premeditation to the prosecution's case. The financial motive became clear during the investigation. Andrew Borden was worth approximately $300,000 at the time of his death, equivalent to about $9 million today. There had been ongoing disputes about Andrew's will and fears that he was planning to leave a significant portion of his estate to Abby. Just months before the murders, Andrew had given Abby's sister a house, which infuriated his daughters. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Josiah Blaisdell ruling that there was sufficient evidence to hold Lizzie for trial. She was committed to the Taunton jail to await her day in court. The months leading up to the trial were filled with intense media coverage. Newspapers across the country followed every development in what was being called the trial of the century. Lizzie's defense team was formidable, led by Andrew Jennings, the Borden family lawyer, and George Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts. The prosecution was handled by Hosea Knowlton, the district attorney, and William Moody, who would later become a U.S. Supreme Court Justice. The trial began on June 5, 1893, in New Bedford, Massachusetts. The courthouse was packed with spectators, reporters, and curiosity seekers who had traveled from across New England. The prosecution's case rested on several key points: Lizzie's inconsistent statements, her behavior after the murders, the burned dress, and the lack of any evidence of an intruder. They painted a picture of a woman driven by greed and resentment to commit patricide. The defense, however, argued that the evidence was entirely circumstantial. They portrayed Lizzie as a devoted daughter and pillar of the community, who was being persecuted because of anti-Irish sentiment and class prejudice. One of the most dramatic moments of the trial came when the prosecution attempted to introduce Lizzie's inquest testimony. During the inquest, conducted just days after the murders, Lizzie had given several conflicting accounts of her whereabouts. However, the defense successfully argued that this testimony should be excluded because Lizzie had not been properly warned that she was a suspect. This ruling was a major blow to the prosecution's case. The prosecution's star witness was Bridget Sullivan, the Irish maid. Her testimony was crucial, because she was one of the few people who could account for the movements of everyone in the house that morning. Bridget testified that she had been washing windows on the outside of the house and later went to her room to rest. She insisted that she never saw an intruder and that the house had been locked and secure. Under cross-examination, however, the defense was able to raise questions about Bridget's memory and her possible bias. They suggested that she might have had her own motives for wanting to deflect suspicion. The defense also called attention to the lack of blood evidence on Lizzie's clothing. Given the brutal nature of the attacks, they argued the perpetrator would have been covered in blood. The prosecution countered that Lizzie could have stripped naked to commit the murders, then washed and changed clothes before discovering the bodies. This theory, while possible, was considered shocking and unseemly for Victorian sensibilities. Another key point of contention was the timeline. The prosecution argued that the narrow window of time between Andrew's return and Lizzie's cry for help made an outside intruder virtually impossible. The defense, however, suggested that the medical examiner's timeline could be wrong. They argued that Abby could have been killed closer to the time of Andrew's death, allowing for the possibility of an intruder. Character witnesses were crucial to both sides. The defense called numerous members of Fall River Society who testified to Lizzie's good character and Christian devotion. These witnesses painted a picture of a woman who was actively involved in charitable work, devoted to her church, and incapable of violence. Many were prominent members of Fall River Society, and their testimony carried significant weight with the jury. The prosecution, however, was unable to present evidence of any bad character or previous violent behavior. This was partly due to the social norms of the time, which made it difficult to delve into private family matters. One of the most controversial aspects of the trial was the question of motive. Prosecution suggested financial gain and family tensions. They were never able to present a clear, compelling motive. The defense argued that Lizzie stood to inherit her father's wealth, regardless of whether he was alive or dead. They suggested that she had no pressing financial need to commit murder. The question of the murder weapon remained unresolved throughout the trial. While the broken hatchet found in the basement was suspicious, it could not be definitively linked to the crimes. The prosecution's theory was that Lizzie had used the hatchet to commit the murders then, broken off the handle and burned it in the stove. However, they could never prove that the handle had been recently burned or that it contained blood evidence. The defense pointed out that there were multiple axes and hatchets in the house, as was common in that era. They argued that the condition of the basement hatchet was not necessarily suspicious. As the trial progressed, public opinion began to shift in Lizzie's favor. The prosecution's case was seen as weak and largely circumstantial, while the defense had successfully portrayed her as a victim of circumstance. The question of gender played a significant role in how the case was perceived. Many people found it difficult to believe that a respectable Victorian woman could commit such brutal murders. The prosecution faced an uphill battle against these social prejudices. They were essentially asking a jury of Victorian-era men to believe that a church-going spinster was capable of multiple axe murders. The defense's closing argument was masterful, delivered by George Robinson with passion and conviction. He portrayed Lizzie as an innocent woman being persecuted by an overzealous prosecution. Robinson argued that the evidence was not only circumstantial, but also weak and contradictory. He emphasized Lizzie's good character and the lack of any credible motive for such horrific crimes. The prosecution's closing argument, delivered by William Moody, was equally passionate. He methodically went through the evidence, arguing that when taken together, it pointed inexorably to Lizzie's guilt. Moody emphasized the impossibility of an outside intruder and the suspicious nature of Lizzie's behavior after the murders. He argued that her inconsistent statements and the burning of the dress were acts of a guilty conscience. The judge's instructions to the jury were considered favorable to the defense. He emphasized that the burden of proof was on the prosecution and that any reasonable doubt should result in acquittal. On June 20th, 1893, after deliberating for just over an hour, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was packed with spectators who had waited anxiously for this moment. "We find the defendant not guilty," announced the jury foreman. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause, while Lizzie herself reportedly fainted from relief. The acquittal was celebrated by many as a victory of justice over persecution. However, others saw it as evidence that wealth and social status could overcome even the most serious charges. Following her acquittal, Lizzie returned to Fall River, but her life would never be the same. Despite being legally cleared, she remained under a cloud of suspicion that would follow her for the rest of her days. She and Emma inherited their father's estate, making them wealthy women. With their newfound wealth, they purchased a large house in a more fashionable part of Fall River, which Lizzie named Maplecroft. However, the sisters found themselves largely ostracized by Fall River society. Many former friends and neighbors continued to believe in Lizzie's guilt, despite her legal vindication. Lizzie attempted to remake her image, adopting the name Lizbeth and trying to establish herself in more cosmopolitan circles. She developed an interest in theater and reportedly had relationships with actresses, which scandalized conservative Fall River. The relationship between Lizzie and Emma became increasingly strained over the years. 1905, Emma suddenly left Maplecroft and never lived with her sister again, though the reason for their final break remains unknown. Lizzie lived the rest of her life as something of a recluse, though she continued to be involved in charitable activities. She was particularly interested in animal welfare and often cared for stray cats and dogs. She died on June 1st, 1927, at the age of 66, taking whatever secrets she may have had to her grave. Emma died just 9 days later, ending the final chapter of the Borden family saga. But the story of Lizzie Borden didn't end with her death. Almost immediately, the case began to take on legendary status in American folklore. The famous nursery rhyme that everyone knows today, Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks, actually gets the facts wrong. Abby received 19 blows, and Andrew received 10 or 11. The case has inspired countless books, movies, television shows, and even operas. Each generation seems to discover the Borden murders anew, can form their own theories about what really happened. Modern forensic experts have re-examined the evidence using contemporary techniques. Some have concluded that Lizzie was indeed guilty, while others maintain that the evidence is insufficient for conviction. One modern theory suggests that the murders were committed by someone else, entirely possibly an illegitimate son of Andrew Borden. However, this theory lacks concrete evidence and remains highly speculative. Another theory proposes that Emma Borden was the real killer, having returned secretly from Fairhaven to commit the murders. Proponents of this theory point to Emma's sudden departure from Maplecroft in 1905 as evidence of guilt. Psychological profiles of Lizzie have been attempted by modern experts. Some suggest she may have suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, which could explain sudden violent behavior. Others have proposed that she was a victim of childhood sexual abuse, which created the rage and dysfunction that led to the murders. However, these theories remain speculative, as there is no concrete evidence to support them. The Fall River community has embraced its infamous history. The Borden house is now a bed and breakfast where visitors can stay in the very rooms where the murders occurred. The Lizzie Borden Museum attracts thousands of visitors each year, all hoping to solve the mystery or at least understand what happened on that August morning. Tour guides share the various theories and let visitors draw their own conclusions. The case continues to fascinate because it combines so many compelling elements: family, dysfunction, greed, mystery, and the question of whether appearances can be deceiving. It's a real-life locked room mystery that may never be definitively solved. From a legal perspective, the Borden case represents an early example of the importance of physical evidence and the challenges of circumstantial cases. It also highlights how social attitudes and prejudices can influence legal proceedings. The case occurred during a time of significant social change in America. The role of women was evolving, and the idea that a respectable woman could commit such violence challenged Victorian sensibilities. The massive media coverage of the trial was also relatively new for its time. The Borden case was one of the first trials of the century to be followed nationally by newspapers. This media attention helped establish many of the tropes we still see in high-profile criminal cases today. The focus on character, the battle between prosecution and defense narratives, and the public's fascination with the defendant's personality. So what really happened on August 4th, 1892? After more than 130 years, we still don't know for certain. The evidence against Lizzie, while suspicious, was largely circumstantial. Her inconsistent statements, the burned dress, and the family tensions create a compelling case for guilt. However, the lack of physical evidence, the absence of witnesses, and the social improbability of such violence from a Victorian spinster create reasonable doubt. The jury's quick acquittal suggests they found the prosecution's case unconvincing. If Lizzie was innocent, then who killed Andrew and Abby Borden? The house was locked there, was no evidence of burglary, and no strangers were seen in the area. The killer would have needed intimate knowledge of the house layout, the family's routines, and the timing of everyone's movements. This points to someone within the household, or very close to the family. Some have suggested that Bridget Sullivan, the maid, could have been the killer. However, she had no apparent motive, and her testimony was generally consistent and credible. The mystery deepens when we consider the brutality of the attacks. These weren't just murders. They were acts of extreme rage and violence. Whoever killed the Bordens hated them intensely, or was in the grip of some psychological breakdown. The overkill suggests a personal motive rather than a robbery gone wrong. Modern criminal profilers would likely describe this as a crime of passion committed by someone close to the victims. The location of the murders in the family home during daylight hours also suggests domestic violence rather than stranger violence. Perhaps the most compelling argument for Lizzie's guilt is the simple question, if not her, then who? After more than a century of investigation and speculation, no alternative suspect has emerged with both motive and opportunity. Yet the equally compelling argument for her innocence is the lack of direct evidence. In our modern justice system, would such a case even go to trial based solely on circumstantial evidence? The Lizzie Borden case ultimately serves as a mirror for our own attitudes about guilt, innocence, and the nature of evil. Some see her as a victim of prejudice and circumstance, others as a cunning killer who escaped justice. What we do know is that on August 4th, 1892, 2 people were brutally murdered in their own home. The case consumed a community, divided a nation, and created a legend that endures to this day. Whether Lizzie Borden was a grieving daughter wrongly accused or a calculating killer who committed the perfect crime, her story continues to captivate us. It reminds us that sometimes The most ordinary seeming people can be capable of extraordinary things, both good and evil. The house on 2nd Street still stands in Fall River, now a museum and bed and breakfast. Visitors come from around the world to walk through the rooms where Andrew and Abby Borden met their violent end. They sleep in Lizzie's bedroom, eat breakfast in the dining room where she was questioned by police, and try to imagine what really happened on that sweltering August morning. Some claim to feel the presence of the victims. Others search for clues that might finally solve the mystery. But perhaps the real power of the Lizzie Borden case isn't in solving it, but in what it reveals about human nature. It shows us how family tensions can explode into violence, how social prejudices can influence justice, and how mysteries can become myths. So was Lizzie Borden guilty of murdering her father and stepmother with an axe on that August morning in 1892? After examining all the evidence, considering all the theories, and weighing whole the arguments, the answer remains tantalizingly elusive. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Final word count, 7,524 words runtime, approximately 60 minutes.